you all for the great panel, and all the panels this morning have been terrific, so thank you all. So with that, we're going to get started on the impacts on fisheries management, and this is going to run roughly an hour, probably half a little bit more for presentations and then discussion and questions, just as we did. We'll get a new Minty up here in just a second. And then remember, we're going to take some time to organize for a breakout group before our mid-afternoon break. And with that, Fiona, I'm going to turn it over to you to help you lead the charge.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I just wanted to start off with thanking our panel members and the audience for your time today. It is a Friday, and it did snow out, at least in Massachusetts, so it's more fun to be head outside. Anyway, we have a number of speakers today for this topic. First off, we have Julia Beatty. She is a fishery management specialist at the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council. There, she mostly works on black sea bass, chub mackerel, and offshore wind. She's going to kick off our discussion on the impacts of offshore wind might have on fisheries management. She'll be followed by Chris Orphanides and Nick Sisson, although I think Chris will be giving the main presentation for that team. Chris currently works at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in the Protected Species Branch, and he's serving on the Science Center's Protected Species Wind team. Nick is a Marine Resources Management Specialist with the Protected Resource Division at GARFO. Current work is focused on evaluating effects of offshore wind on ESA listed species and coordinating other research to understand the effects on the marine ecosystem. Then we have Dave Zakor. He is USM Regents Professor at University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. He also serves on the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council's Science and Statistical Committee, and will be providing his thoughts on the impacts to fisheries management, and I think focusing on allowable biological catch. After Dave, we have Jason McNamee. Jason is a Deputy Director for Natural Resources at Rhode Island DEM. He's also the chair of the New England Fishery Management Council, SSC. I don't think that's changed. And he'll be giving us a state's perspective on potential impacts. And last but not least, we have Mary Beth Tooley, who's in charge of government affairs for the O'Hara Corporation, where she coordinates government and regulatory affairs for commercial fishing operations on both coasts. She definitely has her hands full. And she'll be providing the industry perspective on impacts from offshore wind. So I'll hand it over to Julia, and Julia, just so the other speakers know, will be running the slide deck. Thank you.
Okay, I'm assuming you can all hear me and see my screen.
Yep.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to jump right into it. So I first wanted to start off by saying that acknowledging that our current fishery management programs that we have in this part of the world are arguably quite complex, and they include a number of different management measures, such as those shown on the screen here. So we use a combination of things like total catch and landings limits, possession limits, minimum fish sizes, gear restrictions, spatial and seasonal closures, permit restrictions, allocations, reporting requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes we're doing all of these things all together for the same species. And we do this because we are trying to achieve a number of different objectives. So we're trying to do things like prevent overfishing and rebuild overfished stocks, achieve optimum yield in the fisheries, have some degree of fairness and equity in our management measures, minimize bycatch and mortality from bycatch, minimize interactions with marine mammals and endangered or threatened species, and protect marine habitats. And we have to do all that while using the best scientific information available and minimizing costs. And I want to emphasize that all of these objectives on the screen here are things that we are legally mandated to do. So we've set up these complex management programs to try to achieve a number of different objectives. And when we think about the impacts that offshore wind energy development might have on fisheries management specifically, we need to first think about how will offshore wind energy development impact who fishes, where, when, with what gear, and for what species. And if there's any changes in that, how will that change things like mortality rates for target species and non-target species that are caught in the fisheries? How will that change fisheries interactions with marine mammals and threatened or endangered species? How will that change the impacts of the fisheries on marine habitat? And if there's changes in any of those things, will that change the effectiveness of our current fishery management measures in terms of meeting our objectives? We need to be able to understand that because we will need to evaluate if our measures continue to be effective, and we might want to adjust our management measures. And it could go both ways. Our management measures could become less effective, or maybe they'll be too effective in the future. We want to understand what the impacts are to continue to have effective fishery management programs and meeting all those different objectives. And importantly, will we have the data that we need to fully understand and measure these changes? So the changes in fishing effort and the changes in the impacts to things like fishing mortality and these other factors. And will we have the data that we need to analyze the impacts of any changes in our management program to try to address any of these changes that are happening out there on the water? So when we think about what these changes might mean for fisheries management, we also need to think about how the impacts will be different depending on the type of fishing activity. So for example, it's entirely likely that the commercial and the recreational fisheries in a broad sense will respond quite differently to offshore wind energy development. And the same could be said for different gear types within the fisheries. So hook and line gear, pot trap, or trawl gear, those types of fishing activities might see different impacts from offshore wind energy development. And it's important to understand how those different types of fishing will be impacted differently, because these different types of fishing have differences in things like the size of fish that are caught, the discard mortality rates for the fish that are caught but not retained, and in some cases, some pretty major differences in terms of the data that we get from the fisheries, in terms of what data do we have and how it's reported. And this was touched on earlier today with the fishery-dependent data discussion, where some vessels are using VMS and some aren't. And there's pretty major differences in the commercial and recreational data as well. So it's important to understand all these things and account for it, because these different types of fishing and these differences in terms of things like what they're catching, discard mortality rates, et cetera, those all have implications for different parts of our management process. So for example, they have implications for stock assessments, and the stock assessments are really the backbone of our management program. So the stock assessments need to account for things like differences in the size of fish caught and discard mortality rates. And obviously data considerations are extremely important for stock assessments. But also another example of how this might impact our management program is, in several cases, we allocate the total catch or landings among commercial and recreational sectors, for example. And if, as a result of offshore wind energy development, there's a change in the contribution of the commercial and recreational sectors to total catch, what will that mean for the continued effectiveness of our allocations? So these are just examples of things that we're going to need to think about moving forward. I only have 5 minutes, so in conclusion, we need to continue to meet our legal mandate as a fishery management body to continue to do things like prevent overfishing, minimize bycatch, account for the importance of fishery resources to fishing communities. We have to continue to meet all those mandates. And like I said, that's why we have our current complex fishery management program. So how can we continue to meet those objectives while also being flexible and adaptable in the face of many challenges that we're trying to figure out how to deal with? And it's not just offshore wind energy development, it's also challenges from things like climate change and the impacts that it is having on distribution of fish stocks. So how do we balance all that? That's kind of an ongoing challenge. And I don't have a good answer for that, but it's a good topic for discussion during this workshop. It'll be important to holistically evaluate our current management system as conditions change and considering complex future scenarios, so the cumulative effects that we talked about earlier today. And basically my take-home message is that we need to understand how fishing effort might change before we can consider how fisheries management might need to adapt to offshore wind energy development. And that's all I had, and I'm running the slide. So next up is Chris Orphanides, and I'm not sure if you're ready to go, but take it away whenever you're ready, I guess.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Chris, you sound good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks for having us. As Fiona mentioned in the beginning, I'm Chris Orphanides from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and since the spring I've been dealing with, I've worked for the Protected Species Branch, and since the spring I've been dealing with protected species as far as offshore wind is concerned. And so I'll present, we only have this one slide here, and I'll present, and Nick Sisson can chime in as needed or if I forget anything. So we were asked to talk about how protected species may be impacted by fisheries management relative to offshore wind. And the primary issue is whether fishing effort will shift and how that will impact protected species, in particular in terms of bycatch and entanglement. So that's the primary issue, and there's a few questions there. So one is the fishing gear going to move out of the wind areas? Is some gear going to move into the wind areas? Also, will the gear, will people switch gears? What type of gears they're fishing? For example, if perhaps pot or trap gear might be more attractive if it's less likely to get entangled in turbines, that sort of thing. So these are questions we don't know. So what we don't know a whole lot, and that's why there's only one slide here. But basically, we need to know how fishing effort will shift or won't shift with the when wind farms are put in place. And so we could wait until the wind farms are in place and monitor that and assess what that means. Or there's also efforts underway by the social sciences branch in the Northeast Fisheries Science Center to model potential shifts in fishing gear. So if that happens, then there are things we do know that we could then apply to that model. So we have a sense of bycatch rates for protected species, particularly in gill nets and trawls. Pot or trap gear it is a little bit more tricky. It's hard to observe the actual bycatch until after the fact if there's a problem, and oftentimes not even then. So getting estimates for impacts of pot or trap gear on protected species would be a little tricky. We also have protected species distribution models, so marine mammals and especially marine mammals, perhaps some with sea turtles. We have some distribution models that we could apply to any shifts in fishing effort and see what the shifts in fishing effort may mean and how it would overlap with marine mammal distribution. Although we don't know what the shifts in marine mammal distribution might be. So, for example, seals and dolphins may find those areas attractive if it aggregates prey. So perhaps those animals would be more present in wind energy areas, whereas some other species may not want to be in that area. And we don't know also if there's going to be oceanographic effects that would affect plankton and things like that. So, which might lead to shifts in distribution of large whales. So basically, we need to know to kind of summarize. We need to know the changes in fishing patterns, and there's some modeling that is underway but not finished, as far as I know. Otherwise, we're kind of limited in what we can do at this point. So that's the primary issue, and if we get some sort of information on the modeling on distribution of changes, potential fishing effort changes, then we can apply some other things to get a sense of the impact. But I think that's about it I have for now. Nick, feel free to chime in if I've missed some key points.
Okay, I don't hear anything from Nick. So next up, we have Dr. Secor.
Great. Well, thank you. And I was given this somewhat technical topic of acceptable biological catch, but it is critically important because it sets the upper cap on our quota allocations. And it's determined by two things. One is the level of stock biomass that is assessed regularly by our NIMS centers. And then secondly, and you can see in the control rule how that has a very big impact as we move from the biomass that gives us maximum sustainable yield and move into lower biomass levels. The second element is not an assessed quantity, but a deliberated level that is the work of the SSE. And over the past 5 years, we've developed a 9-point deliberation process, and you see all the items that we consider. And what we're doing in terms of building uncertainty in is we're recognizing that assessments have scientific uncertainty, and this is part of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. And we buffer against that uncertainty to produce desired risks of overfishing. And here you can see that in the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council assessed stocks, that is black sea bass and summer flounder, we ascribe higher certainty levels to summer flounder than we do for black sea bass. And that means for black sea bass, for a given stock size, we have to assign a lower ABC, and that comes with real costs. And in terms of how wind energy might impact our deliberations on uncertainty, I've highlighted several items, and we've heard about how fishery independent and fishery dependent landings data streams could be impacted this morning and a little bit with Julia's presentation. And so some of these factors we would say would be directly impacted and might lead to a lower assessed or higher assessed uncertainty level. Oh, next slide, please. Next slide, Julia.
I just switched it. Can you see it now?
No, that's interesting.
Your screen might have, sometimes your screen freezes, so you have to click share again and that will help it go forward.
But,
Okay, I'll stop sharing and share again.
okay, I can keep droning on, but the first point is that here we go. So I've shown the uncertainty levels across the stocks that the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council manages. And there's a lot of interest, obviously, by stakeholders, by scientists, the whole community that is working to try to reduce uncertainty, because we know it comes to costs not only in quota, but also costs in the recreational sector, costs to those that have a vested interest in certainty assessment, or interest in things like forage fish function, or how climate change is impacting stocks, and so on. And so there's constant look anew at certainty levels that we ascribe to different stocks. And ways that we can work to reduce uncertainty have to do with continued sustained investments in monitoring, iterative improvements in the use of existing data, particularly things like landings data that comes from the fishing sectors. Key linchpin research has really been useful in shifting stocks from one uncertainty level to another, such as Atlantic mackerel and black sea bass in recent history. And then model elaboration flexibility, particularly use of multiple models, have been important. So we're all working to try to improve certainty in the assessments. But we're working against headwinds against these improvements. And we heard from our captains this morning that there's a lot of non-stationarity out there. There's eruptions of squid that show up in our near shelf waters. There's depletions of Atlantic mackerel that must have an ecosystem component. There's things that happen in food webs and recruitment, and these can often work against uncertainty, but because there are uncertainties that we must consider in our ABC determinations. And then there's another class that I would call interventions, and this may happen when we change survey vessels. It happens when we have big hurricanes moving through, we can't get out, and of course this year it's happened because of the pandemic. And I would classify offshore wind development as another type of intervention, one that is going to be obviously much larger in regional and temporal scope, but it's another intervention that, as Dr. Gabriel highlighted, we're trying to work through. Well, I have two hats today. With my Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council hat, I'll ask the question, can we assess these costs? I think we have Ben Gallardi at an earlier session, mid-October, highlight how we could do this at the starting point with our commercial fisheries, but we have many more sectors and stakeholders that are interested, where evaluation will be much more difficult to assess. I do think we can address in some positive way, and SSC can have a role here because we have a slate of economists who can guide and perhaps advise on this effort. With my academic hat, I looked around and I couldn't find much in terms of past discussions, say between BOEM and commercial fishing sectors, on whether this was another mitigation this uncertainty, which clearly does have costs in reducing the ADC and quota. So I throw that up as another discussion item. Can we mitigate by supporting data and science in support of reducing uncertainty? Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. Next up, we have Dr. McNamee.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Hi, everybody. I was cruising around, checking out who all was on the call, and a lot of folks out there I hadn't seen in a while. So nice to see you all, even if it's only virtual. And thank you, Fiona, for inviting me to present. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the perspective from a little further inshore and give you kind of a state perspective on this. I work for a state agency, and we also here in Rhode Island happen to be home to the first offshore wind farm in the US, which occurred just outside of Block Island. And you can see a picture of that small project, kind of a pilot project, but that occurred right here in Little Rhodey. And the picture up on the top there is Block Island in the distance, and the turbines a little bit closer in. So this hadn't happened before. There was no real blueprint for the fisheries impact part of the operation. And so as the process was unfolding to develop this, this offshore wind farm in Rhode Island, we had to build the process from scratch. And that went from everything from the before after control impact survey designs that we were trying to set up, the scientific surveys to kind of look at potential impacts from the turbines. Another thing that came up was information networks. And so in most states, the Coastal Zone Management Agency is generally not the same agency that manages fisheries, and that's no different in Rhode Island. And so there was a disconnect there, and the information networks that we use to get information out to the industry for things like possession limit changes and regulatory changes, the offshore wind developers didn't have access to those. So we had to figure out a good way to get information from the development that was going on to the fishermen out there, so that they would know what was going on, where they weren't going to be able to go, when meetings were going to occur, things of that nature. Facilitation of mitigation processes, that was another one where the state agency didn't really get involved in that. It was mainly between the industry members and the developer. However, the state agency gets involved because we're the ones that manage the licenses. And so we had to sort of verify and help try and help the developers understand, you know, what needed to be mitigated. And so we had a role in that as well. And then one of the big ones that came up was economic impact studies. And so that was one, you know, some of the information that was out there in the beginning at the highest levels of trying to understand the impact of these on the fishing industry. The economic studies, they were lacking resolution. And so the state agency in Rhode Island was able to kind of get involved and help get information into that, so the true impacts that were occurring to the industry were better understood. And you know, we had to work through a lot. It wasn't an easy process here in Rhode Island. I think, you know, talking with our industry here, the fishermen felt sort of caught between the developers and states that were eager to, you know, make their mark in getting clean energy going in the state and you know, all of these are good things. Development creates jobs, and clean energy creates jobs, and this is all good stuff. But there was conflict, and there wasn't a good mechanism to sort of move between these different bodies. And so the state agency really stepped in here in Rhode Island. And we served as kind of an intermediary in that process. Next slide, please. So the projects, they move further offshore, but we still have pretty strong engagement in what's going on. And so the map up on the top there on the right-hand side, that's the OSAMP, or the Ocean Special Area Management Plan area that exists off of Rhode Island between state and federal waters. And you can see it kind of stops right there at the very top, where there's kind of that straight line that goes from point to point. Up above that's Narragansett Bay. And so that Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, that wasn't a part of you know, some of the planning that was going on to take into account fisheries and things of that nature. And so we've had to catch up, because even though these projects are pretty far offshore, the cables have to come inshore at some point, and there are impacts with those cable routes as well. And so we still have pretty strong involvement in you know, taking account of the impacts that are going on. The impacts aren't only in these offshore areas in the exact proximity of the leases. They kind of extend away from those leases. And so we need to understand those impacts just as much as we need to understand the very direct impacts in the lease areas. A lot of the management uncertainties mentioned by the other speakers, they have an inshore component. So assessment uncertainties, those impact shoreside operations. And one thing that we haven't thought much about until it actually started happening was, with these uncertainties, it makes people tentative when they want to invest. And so you're not going to invest in a new fishing business if you're kind of uncertain about, you know, the future and what's going to happen. And, you know, do we need to steam an extra, you know, 200 miles to get to our grounds? Those sorts of things, those can impact investment on the shore side part of all of this. I mentioned the cable routes already. And one of the things that we encountered in Rhode Island is we actually lost one of our traditional fixed gear locations, because it was the only place that one of the cables could come inshore. And in addition, once you get up inshore, the area gets smaller. And so your ability to move away from an area, you're pretty boxed in. Narragansett Bay is, in the grand scheme of things, we think it's great, but it's not very big. And so displacement gets really severe inshore if it's not thought about ahead of time. And then there are mixed reactions. So some in the fishing industry, they thought this development was great. You know, they were thinking about sort of a de facto artificial reef type of situation, and then others viewed it more negatively. And so this really complicates. A lot of those discussions are occurring in the states as well as at the federal agencies and the federal councils, and it makes things very complicated. And then finally, many New England stocks and smaller scale fisheries, those are important to state operations, and many of them rely on data limited and survey-based assessments. So one of the keys that we really need to solve as we march forward here is we need to figure out how to deal with the impacts on our scientific surveys, because there's a lot of fishery assessment, fishery information for very important fisheries to the states that rely on these surveys. And I have a couple of plots of this skate complex. So that's a big fishery in Rhode Island, and it relies on survey information. And so we need to get that part of the puzzle solved to mitigate those impacts. And with that, I am pleased to pass the mic over to Mary Beth.
Thank you, Jason. Just need to point out bonus points for you. You referenced the skate complex on your slide. Love it. Mary Beth, are you ready?
I think so. Can you hear me good?
Yes, I can.
All right. Well, thank you very much. As Fiona has said earlier, my name is Mary Beth Tooley. I work for the Ara Corporation. We are home based here in participate.
Mary Beth, you're
Multiple-
coming in and out a little bit, so maybe try to get a little closer to your phone. I'm not sure. Let's see, now you're fully muted. See if Maggie can. Maggie, do you want to see if you can?
Hi, Mary Beth. If you're on your phone right now, if you just go to the bottom left of your video screen, you can switch to your phone audio. All you need to do is hit pound and hit the number it tells you at the top there, and then hit pound again.
How
and then
about now? Is that any better?
Yes,
Yes.
that's much better. Thank you. Thanks, Mary Beth. Sorry to interrupt.
How about now? Is that better, Pat?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay,
Thanks.
sorry.
No problem.
I just got two laptops up and I confused the hell out of myself. Sorry about that. But anyway, so we operate in multiple fisheries, some on the East Coast, West Coast. On the East Coast, we have 13 vessels that will be fishing in and around these wind arrays and in the scallop and herring fisheries. And those boats range from 70 to 125 feet. And the impacts will be different. Clearly, scallops are sedentary species, don't move around too much, and herring are quite migratory and move throughout the year. So the impacts to those are different, but some of the management have some similarities in that spatial management and the spatial management system addressing, habitat, directed catch, bycatch species. This will be a new overlay, and for our boats and their size, we look at arrays as areas that will be closed to us, given the size of the vessels, the gear that they use, the maneuverability and safety issues. New closed areas, and depends on where all of them end up. And we have some we're looking at it right now, saying, okay, the area off of Rhode Island, and it doesn't have a great impact on the scallop fishery, except for we clearly move boats in and out of New Bedford. For herring, that's something entirely different. So it will have a large impact on our winter fisheries because that's where herring like to go. So, as we move forward with these particular areas and other areas that we can do something of concern. And the other piece that is similar across the fisheries we participate, others as well, is the scientific uncertainty. Those are the two major things, access and assessing, our stocks and being able to viable fisheries for both the individual vessels and the crew, rely on them for their living. Well, then, when you think in terms of, how does fisheries management, how does the system adapt? Well, I think that people have outlined, many of the major things previous speakers have that will come into play. But when you look at the system that we have right now, when I am a past member of the New England Fisheries Council, spent a lot of time in that venue. It is not flexible in time.
Sorry to interrupt. I think this sounds a little bit, we can mostly hear you, but it's in and out. I just want to try one more thing to see if we can do better. Maggie, do you have any other suggestions? So I want to hear everything Mary Beth is saying, and we're maybe getting 80% of it. So any thoughts for further tech help?
Yes, I'm not sure. It sounds like you're dialed in on, or you're on two laptops. So I don't know if you have a headset that you can plug into the laptop that you're using for audio.
No, I don't currently have one. I really only have audio turned on one laptop, not two.
Okay, it's a little bit fuzzy. I don't know if you can get any closer to the microphone on the laptop that you're using, then maybe.
Mary Beth, try this. Turn off your video because it could be a bandwidth issue, and then get closer to your computer mic if you can know where it is, which I don't know where mine is. And then let's give that one last shot.
Try that again, Pat. What did you recommend?
There you go. If you turn off your video, it could be a bandwidth issue. And
It is turned off.
okay, and I think your other computer's on, I guess, whatever that's worth. And then, sorry about that. And then maybe speak directly right into the computer pretty close up. That might help.
Yeah, I'm as close as I can get. So,
What you just did is great.
oh, what I just did is great. Okay, I picked it up. So, I guess trying to remember exactly where I'm at. I guess the lack of flexibility in the management system. So, I expect that, you know, us and many other people involved in multi-species fishing, the list goes on, that everybody's going to be looking for ways to adapt and meet regulatory change. Even a minor regulatory change requires, you know, analysis and time. 12 to 18 months should be what's expected. The agency and councils have limited resources, and people are always vying for those resources to better manage the fisheries they participate in. So it will be interesting to see. Adaption, not a system that is good at reacting. Having everybody better get in line. I guess that's the ultimate recommendation that I would say to people, because the list is going to be long. And I also think in terms of the Magnuson-Stevens Act and the primary goal of fisheries management across the country to achieve optimum yield, and that is going to be a struggle. So we have a lot of challenges in front of us, and it will require, you know, everyone to work together and multiple resources we don't currently have. So it is something to think about. And
I think Fiona, I think Mary Beth, I think we captured about 90% of that. Fiona, was there anything else from Mary Beth we were expecting?
I don't think so. So I think she covered everything, that all this is going to, and just to reiterate her last point, all this is going to take a lot of time, and the council's priorities, I don't know if most of you have joined in those conversations, they already have a lot on their plate. So I think her last point about getting in line was you're gonna have to start getting on the list to make sure this gets done in a timely manner.
Great.
Thank you.
Fiona. And did that cover your presenters? Are we ready for questions, or do you have more you want to cover first?
We are ready for questions.
All right, so let me share the Mentimeter screen here. Bear with me. I would note that there was a question about right whale. So Brian put in the chat actually a link about the right whale piece, and I'll actually ask that about verbally in just a second as well. So the first question to the panel is, what are the tools that you all are using to try to evaluate at least about how both commercial and recreational fishing might change with the advent of offshore wind? So granted that we don't really know, as Chris pointed out, until you do it, you know, are there efforts to try to model it, surveys trying to at least predict people's behavior as best they can? What are you using in the face of uncertainty?
This is Chris Orphanides. I don't I know that the social sciences branch is developing a tool to look at that. I think it's still underway. It's not finished yet. I don't know if anyone else on the call, Doug maybe could add any more information about that tool.
Yes, Chris, we are starting to explore site choice models as part of an ongoing work looking into effort displacement that has just started. We probably won't have any results for a little bit of time, but we are starting that.
Anybody else want to add to that? And I'll then go to an additional question.
Maybe just one other, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, first, I think we're trying to really get a handle on what's actually happening right now, because in a lot of cases, it's tricky to get really fine scale data on where exactly fishing is happening and where it might move. So that's an important first step, is figuring out exactly how are things right now to be able to determine how things will change.
Yeah, I was going to offer a very similar thing to what Julia just said. One of the things we realized really quickly was how much we were lacking by way of information we needed just to understand who is out there, who's in this area, and what are they doing. There was really a shocking lack of information, and I think it's the nature of fishing to be sort of close to the vest on that sort of stuff, and that's fine. But these events have really, as well as other recent events, have really highlighted the need to get information directly from so this is fisheries dependent data. And so that's going to be a critical element to kind of improve those systems and sort of show how they can actually help the industry rather than hurt. So I agree with that.
This is Chris again. For data right now, we do have for people that are fishing for federally managed species, we do have observer data and vessel trip report data. We'll soon probably likely have electronic monitoring data as well. And so there's a number of data sources that we could use to characterize what's going on in those areas right now, at least for fisheries that are focused on federally managed species.
Right. Anything else on that question? I'm going to go to another. So there's this, I think there's just a little bit of back and forth in the Menti, and Mary Beth touched on it, but this question of, there's a lot of changes that happen all the time. It's a very dynamic piece out there. The council's had decades of kind of getting practiced at these various changes. So one view would be, hey, the council's kind of used to this. You'll just adopt. You've got the methods to do it. Someone else says, geez, what about, do you need to form something different within the councils, like council win committees? And then I think to the point of Mary Beth on all these competing demands on the council to make changes for any number of things, can they process these in the time that things are happening and be able to actually have management adjusters? Management going to be kind of a lagging indicator, 12, 18, or even 2 years behind the 8 ball, so to speak. So I know that's maybe a tough question, but curious if the panelists could give a crack at a few things that came up in Menti.
Well, I think that we're always going to be behind.
I think Mary Beth noted they're going to always be behind. We can maybe make that assumption given resources and time and demands. Other perspectives on that people want to share, and then I'll go to a different question.
Well, going back to the glass is half full, we heard earlier, these turbine farms provide observation system platforms that can get us closer to getting data into the assessment stream than a lot of the more traditional approaches. So we should look at that as a potential of mitigating against some of this lag, that we might actually be able to get some streams of information through telecommunications and observing systems more rapidly than we have traditionally.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for kind of a different framing. Okay, there was this very specific question about right whales. So what impacts do you think offshore wind farms will have on northern right whales? So I don't know, Bohm, if you're on the line, anybody there, or Chris, you may work in that area as well, if you have thoughts about what you know so far about that.
Yeah, this is Chris. I'm glad someone asked that question, because after I presented, I realized I probably should have touched on that. There's a few different concerns. One would be, and not all fisheries related, there's concerned about vessel strikes, which is a primary cause of death for right whales, with vessel strikes with increased vessel traffic due to construction of these wind farms and also the maintenance. One primary issue is concern about noise during construction. And the developers so far seem to put a lot of thought into that issue and have a number of mitigation measures in place. So the thought is that it could either harm them or at least drive them away from that area. There's also a concern, or at least questions, about the impacts on oceanography and prey layers. So, and that's on a couple different scales. It's the individual turbine scale, with the wakes, perhaps, let's say tidal wakes, behind the poles, if that impacts the plankton distribution. And then on a larger scale, with a number of wind farms in place, if that changes the stratification in the water column as well, and the distribution of plankton that things like right whales rely on, and the concentrations, they need very high concentrations of plankton in particular areas. So that those impacts they're starting to be, those questions we're starting to study those, but we have a long way to go there. And the other thing that I touched on indirectly was the potential shifts in fishing gear. So there certainly is a concern if there's a shift towards more pot and trap gear, if that would result in more entanglements of right whales. So the primary concerns for right whales as far as conservation go and fishing gear is entanglement and vessel strikes. So I know there's been talk of some ropeless fishing gear or using that approach, and there's been a lot of progress on that in recent times. And I believe there may be some testing of that gear in these wind energy areas, though I don't know the details about that. But those are the primary concerns that I see, at least off the top of my head. And there's the other issue here is that southern New England, only relatively recently it was found out that right whales seem to use these areas a lot. And it at first seemed to be just primarily January through April, but now there's been a lot more observations in other seasons, including end of August through at least part of October. So so there's a number of concerns there, and there's a number of steps that are being taken and some other research that's being initiated.
All right, so there's a question. Block Island Farm has had positive reef effects on habitat fish and recreational fishing. What might be the methods used to assess enhanced fish abundance, enhanced fishing activity, and recreational and or commercial quotas? Jason, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. I think, it's a good question, and I think it really, I don't necessarily have an answer, a direct answer for it, but I think, with the Block Island Wind Farm, we certainly made there was an effort made to kind of get out, do some sampling beforehand. The design was built to sort of sample before, sample during, sample after, and the idea there, was to kind of track these potential changes that could occur due to things like what this question is sort of getting at. I don't know that we've definitively proven that, but I have heard, on the water observations are sport fishing is good around these structures, and so we imagine it will be the same, with the bigger offshore leases. Again, though, it's hard to understand if you're not out there, if you don't get that research done beforehand to know what's there. It's hard to know how it's actually changed through time. So I think it's really critical, and I think there's, folks are working at this, but it's critical to get out there and kind of track these things before, during, and after. And then to what Dr. Secor said, which I thought was a really good comment. I think there's also an opportunity because you have these stable structures that are out there, and I know at least in some of the discussions, there's a willingness from the developers to kind of work collaboratively, with putting, receivers, all sorts of sampling equipment that can be sort of stationed on these. And so there's an opportunity there to collect data as well that I hope we can collaborate on to take advantage of.
There is one question I don't want to lose past floating. So I don't know if folks on this panel have or haven't thought about how management impacts might differ for fixed wind versus floating wind technology, which we know is kind of further behind, at least on the East Coast, but curious about any differences you've detected so far in terms of management. And if you haven't thought about that yet, that's okay too.
sorry, Patrick, was that to me? And if so, could you repeat, please?
I think it might be to anybody, but it's a question about how might management impacts differ for fixed wind versus floating wind technology.
So I don't have, I've not really thought about that. I'm guessing it would impact the types of fisheries that you need to sort of think about with regard to the impact. So there will still be an impact, just sort of changes which fisheries you might need to focus on. Just a quick thought.
Yeah, I certainly never thought about
Shoot. Mary Beth, you can also, if you have a comment, don't hesitate to put it in the chat too, if you can, because we definitely want to hear what you have to say.
And Pat, we're seeing your screen.
Okay. Oh, this is my screen in terms of, okay, you don't want to see that. Never mind. Thank you. That's a danger.
Dave Secor, and I the things that I've heard anyway, read, is that there's greater entanglement issues with cetaceans and potentially greater elasmobranch interactions because those are they'll be conducting cables as well. They're now up in the water column.
Okay, great. I think there's, I want to actually turn to Julia for this next question, which is, really from the council's perspective, Julia, what kind of conversations are taking place about offshore wind development? Do you feel like the council's had a chance to begin to think and absorb about this? How far along or not do you feel the council, at least from the Mid-Atlantic, is, just from your perspective?
The councils are definitely involved, both the Mid-Atlantic and the New England Fishery Management Councils. We're tracking a lot of this. Council members are involved in ROTA and ROSA. Both councils periodically submit comment letters to BOEM and the Coast Guard on various points of the offshore wind energy development process. The councils don't really have much authority in the realm of offshore wind energy development. So a lot of what we do is writing comment letters and keeping stakeholders informed and tracking things. So I'd say that's largely the extent of council involvement so far, is just trying to keep a handle on everything that's happening so that we can kind of track it, but we haven't really delved all that far into trying to think about how we might need to change how we're going to do things in the future. Because I think right now we're focusing on trying to stay involved and stay up to date on everything that's happened, so we can have better conversations about some of this in the future.
Thanks, Julia. Jason, these might be two questions specific to Block Island, or to the broader perspective. One is the question of reef effect interactions and potentially loss of benthic species to the areas still in the water changes the fish food webs. So I'm curious at Block Island, one, did you see any change to species composition? We talked a little bit about this, I think, the first day, about any kind of adverse effects to the reef effect of the turbines.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and so as we've been chatting here, Julia Livermore from the Rhode Island DEM staff who works a lot on offshore wind and fisheries items, she noted a lot of the work that was done on Block Island is actually not published yet, so I don't know the specific answers to your questions, but there is apparently going to be a slug of information coming out, I think in later this year from that work. So there was a lot of work that was done, from fish pot surveys to lobster pot surveys to trawl. So there's a wealth of information, but there's so much variability in fisheries data that there was nothing necessarily obvious, and then when you want to subject it to statistical rigor as well, you have to wait a little while for that stuff. But I think some of those answers will be coming out a little later this year.
Right. And there was another question about kind of what impacts the cable route at Block Island had on any kind of fishing access, fishing gear, fishing in general, those things. They're not just the product itself, but actually the cable.
Yeah, that was really interesting. So there's a couple of things that went on there. So the one I mentioned during my presentation, we have the kind of, I think other states, other areas have what they call pound nets. We have a version of that in Rhode Island. They're called floating fish traps. And so there was one particular site that was pretty productive for the fishermen, and it just coincided with where the cable needed to come ashore. And I guess there wasn't a lot of flexibility, and that's kind of a segue to the next thing I'm going to say. So there's a lot of surveying that goes on. They try and put these cables in spots where they can bury them so that they don't cause, conflict, discussions about EMF notwithstanding, but as far as the physical cable. And so, there's a pretty significant effort, but even with that effort, it's hard to know things very well when they're on the bottom of the ocean. And so this is one of those instances where they just couldn't route this cable anywhere else, and they lost that trap site, and it got moved up to another location, but wasn't as productive. And as fishermen know, it seems like a simple thing. I'll just move a little further. Well, it's not that simple because there's a lot of dynamics going on. There's a reason why that fisherman had that trap where it was. And then, as the cable is being laid, there's a lot of coordination that needs to occur. Information getting out, I had mentioned that as well. We get information, the state, will get information about where the cable vessels are going to be, and then we're trying to relay that information out so there's not conflict. People can move their, if there's fixed gear in the area, or even if they have just been planning on, dragging in that area or whatever. So there's a lot of coordination that needs to occur as well. And then the final thing I'll mention is, and this is where I was sort of headed earlier, some spots they just could not get the cable to the depth that they had planned on. And so now they had to put cement structures over it. So now there's an area where a dragger can't go anymore. And they're small. And like I said, they make a significant effort to find areas where they can bury the cables as planned. But, the best laid plans, as they say, and you lose little pieces because now there's this big cement mattress kind of on the ground that'll snag a net if you tow over it. I think there's technologies being worked on to mitigate that, but at least during the Block Island experience, that happened in a couple of spots.
Great, thanks, Jason. I want to get to at least two other things. One is that there are a number of comments just about the number of vessel trips that currently, because of G&G surveys and more activity in general across these areas, and whether that will continue as construction's up, and construction obviously, and then after operations, and what that means for management, for survey vessels, for just more boats on the sea, for for kind of the whole impact. If people want to speak to that, I think Brian did mention something in the chat about that as well. I don't know if folks have any views on that. All right, people don't. We'll just note there will be a lot more vessel traffic, and people need to think about that as another impact to potentially assess. There was another question around kind of larger wind turbines, and whether, because they'll be larger, there'll be space further apart, that actually might make the kind of pressures on the existing survey methods less. Or is it so that the distance isn't so much greater that it's still going to have the same impact on some of the survey methods? So can people speak to that? Scale of turbines and impact on survey methods. Anybody want to speak to that?
If nobody else says anything, I guess I'll say something maybe not all that helpful, but I think it's in some lease areas, the ones off of New England, their developers have come together and said they're going to use uniform spacing, and in other places it's to be determined exactly how far apart the turbines are. And I think from a fisheries perspective and from a survey perspective, you know, I'm a fishery manager, so I'm just kind of, this is based on things that people have told me and I've heard in meetings, not my own personal experience, but in terms of the potential for, you know, what we might realistically expect for turbine spacing, which is to be determined, I don't know that I've seen any sort of agreement in terms of developers saying, okay, like we'll put them far enough away that all the concerns will be addressed. It seems to be kind of an ongoing discussion of the balance between what's acceptable from an offshore wind energy developer perspective in terms of cost and generating electricity and what the fishermen think they can safely operate within. And I think that obviously it would be different depending on how far apart they're spaced and the orientation, but I think based on what, you know, has been discussed so far for the potential layout of these turbines, I don't think we've come to a place where it seems like there is agreement that impacts could be minimized or fishermen are happy. And surveys, like obviously there's ongoing discussions about surveys and how they will continue to operate. So I think to some extent it's to be determined, and yes, the degree of the impact will vary depending on the specifics of the layout, but again, I don't know that there's gotten to a place where there's a specific layout that'll work for everybody and make all these issues go away.
So panel, I think we've probably come to the end of most questions. There's a few sort of comments in the Menti as well, I'll just note. So you can kind of see some of the various comments that have come up. So what I think we'd like to do is see if the panel has any final words to offer. And then we're going to talk about breakout groups and the break. So Fiona, anything else your group wants to cover right now?
I just want to say thank you to the panel for your time. But I don't know if any individual panelist has any final comments that they want to share.
Just to say thanks. I appreciated the discussion. I was kind of checking out I think there were some good questions in the chat box there, and I appreciate the discussion. Glad to see this happening. I think it's sorely needed. Thank you.
Great. Panel, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And Maribel, sorry for the sound quality, but glad to hear the comments that you did make.